amongst some of the most virulent far-right forums, Canadian actors were the most frequent posters. That's something I think we need to sit up and take notice, that we're contributing to this toxic environment.
How does the rise in extremism and hate intersect with gender digital hate and harassment? I'm Andrea Gunraj from the Canadian Women's Foundation. Welcome to All Right, Now What? A podcast from the Canadian Women's Foundation. We put an intersectional feminist lens on stories that make you wonder, why is this still happening? We explore systemic roots and strategies for change that will move us closer to the goal of gender justice. The work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and our partners takes place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. Whether you're on social media, streaming platforms, dating, messaging, and meeting apps, or on game sites, if you're a woman, girl, or two-spirit trans or non-binary person, you're at greater risk of hate, harassment, and violence. A recent House of Commons report speaks to the rise of ideologically motivated violent extremism in Canada, based on xenophobic, gender-driven, anti-authority, and other personal grievance-driven ideas and ideologies. The report says that in our age of social media, it can elude the terminology and analytical frameworks long used by our law enforcement and national security agencies, and these long-standing national security threats have been joined by a new breed of violent extremists, lone actors, and leaderless movements whose alliances and espoused causes are constantly mutating. In Canada, we've seen a 72% increase in hate crime since 2019. It's due to increased hate in digital spaces against women, 2S LGBTQIA+ people, and targeted ethnic and religious groups. Over coming episodes, we're delving into gender digital hate and harassment with leading experts and content creators, releasing in-depth episodes every single week. We talk about the problem and what we can do to change it. We offer practical tips to help you in your digital life, and we talk about what it means to take back the tech for all of us. Here to draw lines between rising extremism and gender digital abuse is Barbara Perry, professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University and director of the Centre on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. Barbara holds a UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies and has written extensively on social justice, hate crime, and right-wing extremism. Dr. Perry has made substantial contributions to limited scholarship on hate crime in Canada, including anti-Muslim violence, antisemitic hate crime against 2S LGBTQIA+ communities, and community impacts of hate crime and right-wing extremism in Canada. She's regularly called upon by policymakers, practitioners, and media for her expertise.
I am a professor in criminology and social justice, let's say, at Ontario Tech University in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities. I'm also the director of the Centre on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, which we launched here in 2018, which has been really exciting to sort of watch that grow and build that out. Also recently been named a UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies. So that gives it sort of that international perspective and certainly will broaden, I think, our networks in that respect. I think as the title of the center suggests, I mean, that's really the work that I do. It's fairly wide-ranging. I consider myself, as the UNESCO Chair suggests, an expert in hate studies, which covers a lot of very dark ground. Most of my career has been focused on hate crime, specifically, in particular, the experiences of targeted communities. But more recently, I found myself, by happenstance, really, sort of one of the early and leading scholars, I guess, on right-wing extremism in the Canadian context specifically. One of the things that I guess I like to say is that I'm sort of maybe atoning for my sins as a child. If you ask anyone, especially from my grade school days, not so much from high school, but from grade school, if I would have been working in this space, they would have said, hell no, she was a bully. Literally, I was one of those mean girls. Absolutely. In fact, several years ago, we had a class reunion amongst some of our elementary school friends, and some of the girls in particular that we, at that time women, that we called up to say, hey, we're having this reunion, and why would I want to be with you people ever again? You were so mean to me. This is, I think, in some part, as I say, me sort of atoning for all of that. And, should any of those students, and boys and girls, men and women, be listening, I apologize profoundly. I was a horrible person as a youngster. So trust me, I hope I'm a better person now.
What's the connection between gendered online hate and harassment and far-right extremism?
You can't separate them. They are so intimately intertwined, and I hardly know where to start here in terms of which end of the roll of yarn do we pull out. Let's start with extremism, far-right extremism, which is really what we've been seeing so dramatically increasing over the past almost decade now. It's been on the upswing for a while. We often talk about, the racism and the Islamophobia associated with the far right. I think we're a little quieter on the gendered nature of the movement as well. And that comes through in a number of ways. On the one hand, the adherents are predominantly men, and there is a real toxic masculinity to their presentation of self, to the nature and the intensity of their dialogues, right? That sense of bravado, tough guys, if you will, G-U-Y-S and G-U-I-S-E both, but also really at the core of the far right. If you think about the 14 words, which is one of their key mottos, right? We must secure the existence of the white race and a future for our children. All of that, which, it's foundational to the movement, that implies then a need to control our women. Right? If we want to maintain the sanctity of the white race, then we have to maintain the sanctity of white women. That is, we cannot allow them to be sullied by, interracial relationships, or we can't allow them to make their own decisions about their sexuality and about their choices in life. So I think the gendered piece comes in very clearly on both sides there. And of course, all of this is playing out increasingly in those online spaces. And I think in the offline space, we're seeing it's not just a loss of civility or a lack of civility. We're seeing a real celebration at the political level, at the social level, the cultural level, a celebration, in fact, of disrespect, a celebration of hostility, misogyny, racism. That, I think, is creating this climate, what I've often referred to as a climate of hate, that then is reproduced in the online sphere. And it's exacerbated by the online sphere because there's less accountability. There is some sense of invisibility, even if your name is on your account, right? There's still a feeling of somehow, when you're hiding behind a screen, of anonymity. So it really is another enabler, I think, for people to express the most heinous of notions and threats, in fact.
In your work and research, is there anything that surprises you about the growth of extremism and digital misogyny?
What surprises me is the persistence. And beyond that, not just the persistence, but the dramatic increase that we're seeing in gendered violence, both discursive, and physical, as well as sexual violence that we're seeing directed towards women, that, one would have expected, as with, racism and homophobia and so many other issues, one would have expected by 2023 that, we'd begin to see some ebbing of the problem. And in fact, we're not. We're seeing, I think, a dramatic increase in the last few years in private spheres, but also in very public spheres as well. So in particular, women who are particularly powerful, women who are particularly vocal and visible, independent, and, don't back down from an argument or a confrontation. So women in politics, women in journalism, women professionals at, in high professional positions, they are more and more subject to not just online threats, but offline threats. We've seen several examples of Canadian women politicians being physically assaulted, verbally assaulted in person, their offices graffitied with sexist and misogynistic language. So there is that sort of backlash, I guess, which explains in part that increase. Again, these women have stepped out of line. They're beyond our control now, which also signals then the other part of it, right, is that perceived threat or that perceived loss of status and control over the world around them, and especially the women around them.
It seems like lots of regions in the world have been struggling with regulation and holding tech companies accountable. But is there anything unique you've noticed about the ways these issues play out in the Canadian context?
There is that multiple layers of influence that we're sort of absorbing from other countries, especially from the U.S., but also from our European allies, if you will. So we're bombarded from all sides with those kinds of narratives and those kinds of ideologies. But I think in the Canadian context, I think that I referred earlier to that sort of backlash piece, and I think that in the Canadian context, because we have such a long and embedded history of at least a discourse of multiculturalism, a discourse of egalitarianism and inclusion, that is also part of that threat, that broader threat that that folks perceive. Literally, we're one of the few countries that has a multiculturalism policy. And so everything is understood as politically correct, as being woke. So I think it's really a response to that discursive history, as well as the much more material implications and impacts of that in terms of the rights gains made by women, members of the queer community, racial communities, the whole array. They look to immigration policy as piece of that, right? And immigration policy, which is what has shaped our country for over a century, that is seen as part of that, related to the multiculturalism ethos that is distinctly Canadian, and immigration has resulted in new kinds of threats and new kinds of people that we don't want here. As you say, I think it is the same challenge that all countries are trying to deal with now, is how do we regulate? If they're not going to self-regulate, the media companies, how do we regulate? And I think that's exacerbated by the fact that Canadian far-right actors in particular are very active in the online sphere. Part of our last study, working with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue out of the UK, they found that amongst some of the most virulent far-right forums, Canadian actors were the most frequent posters. That's something I think we need to sit up and take notice, that we're contributing to this toxic environment, punching above our weight, as some will say. Clearly, the social media companies are not self-regulating, yet there's a real hesitancy and unwillingness on the part of the Canadian government, amongst others, to intervene. And I think it is a hesitancy. I think it's almost a fear to intervene and to, poke the bear that is social media.
What are some practical safety solutions you'd offer to users at high risk in digital spaces?
Because you don't want to say, well, just get offline, because that's where we live. And that then silences, whole communities, or would attempt to silence whole communities. So that's not the direction you want to go. You really want to be proactive there, I think. Part of it is about building allyships and about building communities, if you will. I think more importantly even is for the sort of the bystanders, if you will, to not be bystanders, but to be upstanders, and to intervene then, themselves engage or speak back, so that it doesn't fall just to the person or the group or the individuals that are being targeted, but that there's a community that builds up. And then it becomes apparent, right? Because once one or two do that, it's easier for others. And then it becomes apparent that the bullies are outnumbered in those spaces. And so I think that that's really, really empowering for the individual, but also I think for communities, right? It builds up that sense of resiliency and ability to push back. I know people report, and then they give up. And I think we just need to be persistent, right? Like an absolute campaign of reporting. So again, if you've got, several thousand or even several hundred members of a particular page or whatever the case may be, if you all report, right? That gets attention. One person quietly, indicating there's a problem. Might or might not listen. But if you've got this swamp almost, I think that's a tactic that might work. So I think it's about not being silenced, which is the intent of the posters, is to not allow yourself to be, or not allow others, in fact, to be silenced. So if it's a Sikh being targeted, it's especially important for those who are not Sikh to intervene. If it's a woman, for those who are not women to intervene. Bullies do weaken people. They do disempower people. So sometimes it is important for those who are not part of the community to stand up first, or at the very least standing beside.
What are the systemic changes you'd like to see to end gender digital hate and harassment?
For me, I think the first step is let's effectively enforce the legislation that we already have. First of all, first step, right? So let's use the hate propaganda legislation we have. Let's use the hate crime legislation to enhance sentencing when there is an issue. But also, that said, I think that those criminal justice or legal responses are not necessarily the most effective route. I talk about a whole of society response. And I think that the most important role for government here is to support those who are doing the work on the ground, is to fund those who are doing the work, provide them whatever they need to build an infrastructure, to challenge hate wherever they see it, to challenge extremism. So whether it's at the local level and some of the grassroots organizations that respond to specific events or patterns in their own community, or whether it's national organizations that develop programs that can be replicated elsewhere, or develop media campaigns and social media campaigns that are visible. That's one of the most important roles for government, actually, is to support the work that's already being done and support new initiatives as well. Because that's one of the problems. So, we develop programs, and maybe sometimes they're funded first time around. We develop programs, they appear to be working, or they're only funded for 1 year. How do we know in a year if they're effective or not? It's got to be sustainable as well. So you get a 2-year project, looks like it's really working well, but it's not funded for a second round. There goes whatever progress was made.
Are there resources you'd point our listeners to?
I have sort of directions to look to. Any of the national women's organizations that are challenging this, and most are, because a lot of them have toolkits on their websites, right, for how to defend yourself, or how to be more resilient, or how to build a counter narrative campaign, those sorts of things. So there are plenty of resources out there. More and more, I think, at the local level rather than at the national level. So, and local in a couple of ways. So, what are some of the initiatives in your local community? Are there a number of other people who share your concerns? Can you build then a coalition that's intended? Are there civil society organizations in the community that you can pool their resources together to develop initiatives and programs and supports? And then there's the workplace piece, because a lot of these problem issues that we're seeing also emerge in the workplace by the nature of their work. So female journalists, for example, more and more of the organizations that serve those industries are themselves developing, whether it's a women's caucus or women's support framework, or programming around anti-hate. So look to the professional organizations, look to your workplace. The universities, for example, and professors who teach in this space are also targeted. So we're seeing universities building out strategies.
All right, now what? Check out the Center on Hate, Bias and Extremism at ontariotecU.ca. Listen to our November 2022 episode with Barbara Perry on women and white nationalism. Get the facts on gender digital hate, harassment, and abuse by visiting our fact page on CanadianWomen.org. While you're there, read about our new Feminist Creator Prize to uplift feminist digital creators advocating for gender justice, safety, and freedom from harm. Did this episode help you? Did you learn anything new? We want to know. Please visit this episode's show notes to fill out our brief listener survey. You'll be entered to win a special prize pack. This series of podcast episodes has been made possible in part by the Government of Canada. Please listen, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. If you appreciate this content, please consider becoming a monthly donor to the Canadian Women's Foundation. People like you will make the goal of gender justice a reality. Visit CanadianWomen.org to give today, and thank you for your tireless support.